Welcome to Bach 101, an introduction to the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, a presentation of Music Worcester. I'm your host, Dr. Chris Shepard, the Artistic Director of The Complete Bach. Now, let's talk Bach. Hello and welcome to this third of 3 episodes about Bach's cantatas. And why wouldn't it take 3 episodes to talk about the music that is nearly half of everything that Bach ever wrote? In the first of these episodes, we talked about cantatas in general, what they are, and how they slotted into the life of St. Thomas Church and St. Nicholas Church in Leipzig for those 27 final years of Bach's life when they were such a huge part of his job. In the second episode, we got down to brass tacks and we talked more specifically first about Bach's orchestra, because it's important to understand what he had at his disposal there in Leipzig. And then we talked in significant detail about recitatives of 2 types, the dry secco recit, the accompagnato recit, and then the aria, keeping in mind that an aria is really just a song, in the same way that an opera aria is. It is for a soloist, although, as I have pointed out, there are plenty of duets in the cantatas as well. But boy, there is a great deal of other music to talk about in these cantatas, and that is the choral music, those choral movements, because we need to keep in mind that, first of all, there was a chorale, a hymn, in almost every cantata, solo or choral, but 2/3 of the cantatas that have remained to us are choral cantatas. These are cantatas that have at least one freestanding movement for choir, in addition to the recitatives and arias for soloists. As I say, whether it is a solo cantata or a choral cantata, he almost always finishes with a chorale, one of those Lutheran hymns that would have been instantly recognizable to the congregation. Now, there is some question about whether or not the congregation would have sung along with these. We think probably not. They did sing hymns during the service itself, but partly because of the complexity of the arrangements that Bach made in terms of the 4-part working out of the harmonies. That's one reason why we think that it might just have been the choir. But either way, they would have instantly recognized these hymns. Maybe the only equivalent that we could think of in modern society, which is not nearly as churched as Leipzig was during Bach's lifetime, would be how instantly recognizable A Christmas Carol is, for example. But that would have been true for all of those hymns. This hymn, Wie schön leuchtet der Morgenstern, How brightly shines the morning star, is, I believe, one of the more beautiful of all the hymn tunes. It's very bright and sunny. Of course it's bright because it's about the morning star, and sunny. It's in a major key. It's almost all scales with a little bit of chord outline. The beginning of it is a chord outline, for example. But then from there, it's almost all scales. Scale up, then down, little jump, then a scale. You might even have heard this hymn. I am an Episcopal Church musician, and it is in our hymnal, and I know the Lutherans still sing it. Very beautiful hymn. So what would Bach do with these? Well, if you were a music student at any point in your life, you may have been forced to sit at the keyboard and be confronted with 4 lines of music, a Bach chorale. The 2 words Bach chorale still make people who majored in music shudder, because one of the things we were often forced to do was learn how to see those 4 lines and put them into our 2 hands. Let me do that for you right now, see if I have maintained that skill over the years, because that's what Bach did. He would take that chorale melody, it would always be in the soprano line, and he would add harmonies. The harmonies for this particular hymn are not complicated, but boy, there are some extraordinarily complex chromatic harmonies in a lot of Bach's chorale writings. So just listen to this, How Brightly Shines the Morning Star, Bach's 4-part setting. forward, some moving eighth notes in the middle. It's very beautiful, isn't it? And that is so typical of the end of a cantata, to have the melody in the soprano line in 4-part harmony with the alto, tenor, bass below. However, there is the funniest little twist to this particular chorale. I have conducted a number of Bach cantatas, which means I've conducted a great number of Bach chorales from those cantatas. And I have to say, there is only a handful where Bach will do something different other than just having that 4-part harmony. And even within the orchestra, the first violin will play the soprano part, the second violin will play the alto part, and so on. But for this one, because it is the Annunciation, when Gabriel came down to talk to Mary, and we associate Gabriel with either Gabriel's trumpet or Gabriel's horn, listen to what Bach does here. He adds 2 independent horn parts that weave their way in and out of this chorale. I just love that. It is such a lovely surprise. So I'm going to play for you right now a recording that I made with my Bach choir in Sydney, the Sydney and Bach Choir and Orchestra. You'll hear from them again at the end of this episode. And this is just the first section of that chorale. And listen for Gabriel's horns. Now, how long is a piece of string? That is the way that we are going to talk about the choruses in Bach's cantatas, because there are an infinite number of possibilities. A chorus is just a piece that is sung by a choir. It can take so many forms in Bach's music. Many of them, for example, are fugues, and we will have a whole episode in which we talk about fugues later, because they are so central to Bach's writing. A fugue is not just a keyboard piece, not an organ or a harpsichord piece. Many of them are fugues, but we find fugues in his orchestral writing, in his chamber music, and a surprisingly large number of fugues in his choral music. You can also find a number of different forms that we associate more with instrumental music. There is something called a French overture, for example. The beginning of Handel's Messiah is a French overture form. The French overture form, which has these double-dotted chidam, pa-pam, pa-pa rhythms, and then usually has a middle section that is a bit like a fugue, that was used to represent kingship, because we associate French music with Louis XIV and the court. So if the text was about kingship, Bach might choose to use a French overture. There are also a whole host of movements that are based on dance forms. The suite, again, there will be a whole episode about this later, the Allemande, Courant, Sarabande, Jig, that are always in a suite, but then everything else, the bourrées and passepieds and minuets, Bach used those forms and just put words to those melodies that he would write that you could otherwise dance to. So there is such a huge range of types of music that Bach could use in a chorus. And we will talk about this through the next 11 years, and you will see just the wealth of possibilities. However, for today, we are going to concentrate on that second Jahrgang, that second yearly set of cantatas, which you may remember are based on chorales. Because throughout that year, Bach tended in his opening chorus to use something called a chorale fantasia, which I prefer to call a chorale prelude, because that links it in our mind with the compositions for organ that he wrote. A chorale prelude is just a piece of music, and the music itself could be incidentally, like any of those things that I just talked about. It could be a fugue, it could be a French overture, it could be a dance form. But what does it need to have? It needs to have a chorale melody. So how did Bach treat that chorale melody? More often than not, that melody would appear in very long notes in one part, often the soprano part. And a little inside baseball, can I tell you why? It's because, remember what I said, after Bach had been in Leipzig for a few weeks, he realized that his choir was weaker than he had expected. And who would be the weakest? Probably those trebles, because they were the youngest boys in the school. And so it solved a problem to just give them a familiar chorale melody, a hymn tune that they already knew, and have them sing it in long notes above the other three parts. That is called a cantus firmus, a cantus firmus in Latin. And it just means what it sounds like. A cantus is a song, a melody, firmus, solid. So a solid melody in long notes over the top. And that is a tradition that comes to us from the Renaissance. Remembering, as I said, that Bach knew the music of Palestrina very well. Palestrina would do that sort of thing all the time. So we've solved for one of the four variables, that one of the voice parts is going to sing that melody over the top. Remember our three words. Encyclopedic, well, that second Jahrgang is an encyclopedia of cantatas that feature chorales. Economical. So this is where we see the economy of Bach's writing, how he will take one little idea and allow that to generate an entire movement. Well, for these chorale preludes, he was already given the most important musical idea. So what is this musical idea? The beginning of it is just a chord outline, isn't it? That we have that. So then the question is, what does Bach do with that to create the musical material for this opening movement for chorus in BWV 1? Because he is such a sophisticated composer, it won't necessarily be exactly like the melody, but listen to what he does at the very opening of the cantata. He gives this to the second violin. Do you hear the outline in there? It's still there. Well, the beginning of the hymn tune is those two notes, and it is like a trumpet call, like Gabriel's trumpet. Pa, 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 a little fanfare. Remember that word motto that I used before? It is like a motive, but in Bach's music, a motto is even shorter, just a little snippet, and it is a seed that when he germinates it throughout a movement, it creates all of the music that follows. So that motto that we heard that had been introduced in the second violin becomes the music that is shared between the alto, the tenor, and the bass. For example, listen to the bass entrance. Obviously, almost exactly the motto. But what about the tenor? That is very much like the motto without being exactly it. And this is the point of what is called imitative counterpoint. That the different parts imitate one another, often riffing on that opening motto. And together they weave together this new fabric that is based on the opening material, remembering that even that motto was based itself on the chorale. So let me play for you a little bit more slowly so you can hear the interaction. What is happening underneath that cantus firmus, underneath the sopranos, the trebles who are singing the familiar hymn tune in long notes. So it starts with the tenor, bass, then alto, together. So you hear right at the end, that's Wie schön leuchtet, that's the beginning of the hymn, but a little different. And the idea is that the interplay, it's a little bit like a mobile over a baby's crib, that as that material spins around, you get little glimpses of the motto that then goes hiding again into the fabric and then might come again to the fore. Let's play a little clip. So this again is my choir from Sydney. I'm going to play this section and you will hear that the sopranos in long notes just sing the chorale, and then the tenors enter, then the basses, and then the altos. So just this little bit, so you can see that this is the classic chorale fantasia or chorale prelude with the melody in the soprano and the alto, tenor, and bass interacting with one another and creating a new fabric of imitative counterpoint. So here you go. So that shows you how Bach would construct these chorale fantasias. And we've talked about those two E words, encyclopedic and economical. The fact that Bach uses, first of all, pre-existing material from the chorale, and then further, he uses that to create the motto, which then germinates the rest of the movement. And now that third E word, enigmatic. The idea that there is a riddle, a Bach code, just like Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, which contains all of the material for Bach to deliver his musical sermon. I'm going to play for you a recording from 2018 that I made on the stage of Mechanics Hall with the Worcester Chorus and Orchestra, in which I broke down a little bit of this movement from BWV1, Wie schön leuchtet der Morgenstern, so you can hear some of the ideas that Bach encodes, and it starts to allow us to see how much information there is in and behind the music. It's absolutely extraordinary. Yes, you can listen to this music just as music and let it wash over you, and it's beautiful. But as soon as you start to see what Bach encodes, you realize there is a whole other universe of language and universe of meaning behind everything. This is a glimpse into another podcast series that we will have throughout the 11 years of the Complete Bach that we are calling Unlocking Bach. It is about deciphering the code as program notes for upcoming concerts. So let's listen to that clip from 2018. You'll hear individual players in the orchestra, and you can hear how this is put together and what goes into that Bach code.
So before we've even started, we've established that even though it's March, we're meant to be thinking about Christmas, and we are meant to be thinking about the Archangel Gabriel. Now, the first movement, he uses a number of coded messages in it to make you think about Christmas here as well. The first thing that we find is that this is set in 12/8. 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, a sort of rolling kind of pattern. This is often referred to as a pastoral meter, and I think that the best example of it is found in the Christmas Oratorio by Bach. So if that sounded familiar, that is the pastoral movement from the Christmas Oratorio. So by looking at that, we are reminded that 12/8 often means set out in the pasture. And if we had any doubt about that, we have two sets of instruments here to remind us. This is the modern instrument called the English horn, but in the Baroque period, this would have been what is called the corno di caccia, and caccia in Italian means hunting. So this is the hunting oboe, and it has a much more pastoral timbre to it. You can imagine shepherds out in the field playing these instruments. Listen to their material at the very beginning, and you'll see what I mean. You hear that sense of call, like it's calling people in from the fields. These guys, they are what was called the corno di caccia, the hunting horn, and they have a very similar material, and again, it places us outdoors right from the beginning. Now, in doing this sort of thing where you try to decode and decipher Bach, it's okay to go a little far afield. This next idea may or may not be right. I think I'm stretching it more, though I do know that in the Christmas oratorio there is a movement that actually uses the bass line to symbol the rocking of the cradle. So we're going to listen to the cellos and double bass. Imagine the rocking of a cradle. So we have these elements, the 12/8 meter, that means pastoral, hunting horn, hunting oboes. How brightly shines the morning star. The one thing that we haven't heard yet is what the morning star is musically. And this is pretty spectacular because usually you have your violin section and the two different violin sections. But in this case, Bach has decided that principals here, they will play solo on top of the violin section. And I think that these fast-moving 16th notes, I think these are the morning star.
Okay, now I'm going to let you hear the whole movement, that opening movement from Wie schön leuchtet der Morgenstern. One more review of this Bach code so you can listen for it. The pastoral meter, that 12/8, as in the Christmas oratorio symphonia that you heard, that suggests shepherds out in the field, because remember, Annunciation is really Christmas. And then also out in the fields, the instruments da caccia, the hunting oboes, the hunting horns, again placing us out in the fields with the shepherds and the angels. Then that rocking of the cradle, which places us in the manger. And then finally, the Morgenstern itself, the morning star, with those two solo violins in that extraordinary example of instrumentation and orchestration that Bach rarely would have used elsewhere, and only ever for a reason. And then, tying it all together, once the choir comes in, you will hear the cantus firmus, the sopranos singing the chorale melody in long notes on top of everything else, and in the alto, tenor, and bass, that imitative counterpoint. Tenors, bass, and then alto. And you will hear how they interact to create this fabric. So let's hear from my Sydneyan Bach Choir and Orchestra in a recording from 2008. Isn't that just the most beautiful movement? Now, because you are already being trained to listen carefully to Bach and the way he structures his music, I think that you probably noticed by listening to that whole movement that the beginning and the end are the same material. And this is that idea of the ritornello, that section that returns, that we discussed when we talked about arias. We find ritornellos in Bach's choruses as well as we just did in this one. If you remember what I said, the ritornello helps to define the architecture of a movement, and to Bach, architecture is everything. However, there is a slight issue with the architecture of any chorale fantasia or chorale prelude, and that is this, that Bach begins with an already composed piece of music, and that piece of music has its own structure. So a chorale, a hymn, has a structure of its own, and Bach always tries to reflect that structure in the composition that he writes. So we talked about arias being da capo, which means that it goes back to the beginning. There's an A section, a contrasting B section using the same material, the same motto and all of that, but in a different way. And then essentially the A section returns again. That is not true if you are given a chorale whose form is not ABA, whose form is not da capo. As it turns out, so many chorales have a form that can be described as AAB, which means that the opening section repeats usually musically verbatim, though with different text. And then the third section is different. And in terms of proportion, each of them, the A, the second A, and the B, are about a third. But because the A material is repeated, it feels much more substantial because it's essentially 2/3 of the hymn. I'm going to play, forgive this because it's so kind of weird to hear it like this, but I'm going to play the entire chorale melody this time, the entire hymn, Wie schön leuchtet der Morgenstern, just putting some chords in that are more or less like Bach's, but I'm going to play it really quickly so you get a sense of the structure. I should also point out very quickly that even within that A section, that's the first phrase, the second phrase. And why does that matter? Because in the chorale fantasia that you just heard, Bach uses, let's call it phrase A1, and then a little bit of the ritornello, then A2, a little bit of the ritornello, and then A3, and a little bit of the ritornello. A little bit later, you might want to go back and listen to that, and you'll see exactly what I mean by that. And that helps also to delineate the architecture. So let me show you the whole chorale. A1, A2, A3, then it goes back to the beginning, the second A, so second A1, second A2, second A3. Then we get to the new material, the B material. And what's interesting about that, and you will see in a second, how Bach set that in the chorale fantasia. All the rhythm stops. And then it moves along again in the B2. Then B3. So in the B section, there are also 3 phrases. The one where time stops, and then the middle one, which is a lot of A's and G's, just very simple here. Then the last phrase, B3, is a scale down, which in a second will also be very important. Remember what I said, this chorale is all scale outlines, beginning Wie schön leuchtet, or here, Amen, Amen, and then scales. So the outline of it is quite simple. So here's the big question. How does Bach reflect that structure, the AAB of the chorale, in his setting of the chorale Fantasia? Well, first of all, the musical material changes a great deal. When he hits that section where time stands still, he stands still. The choir just sings in 4 parts, like that. So it's no longer the soprano hovering over everything. And then, so that takes care of B, the first phrase, so B1. And then, this is one of my favorite phrases. No kidding, I'm not just saying this to sound dramatic for this podcast episode. This is one of my favorite phrases that Bach ever wrote for a choir. He takes these words, schön und herrlich, which means beautiful and glorious. And first of all, he puts the melody back in the soprano, but not in particularly long notes. And the funny thing is, they're sort of buried. They do not soar over everything else, because I think that what Bach really wants to show this idea of beauty and glory is what he wrote for the other 3 parts. So let me play this together. I just think that it is so beautiful. Do you know what would be better than hearing that on the piano? Let me play that phrase, this B2, schön und herrlich, sung by the choir, so you can hear the reason it's so beautiful is Bach is writing for voices. He uses them perfectly in their range so that the tenor soars, then the alto soars, and it truly is schön und herrlich. Let's listen to that from that Sydneyan Bach choir recording. So we've talked about the B1, where time stands still. We just listened to that gorgeous B2, schön und herrlich. And then the ending. I love this. It is just a scale down. If you remember what I said, that B3 is just a scale down. But how does Bach get to the high note on the word hoch, which means high? It's a wonderful pun. And what he does is he has the choir go up a scale. Basses, give it to the tenor here, gives to the alto. Then hoch und sehr, and then it goes down from on high. It's like the morning star shining down from on high. Again, it is even more glorious with voices. So listen to how the basses hand to the tenor, hand to the alto, and then the soprano takes over. Let's listen to this phrase. It is the B section, phrase 3. Have a listen. So, just a couple more things to say about the architecture of this movement, because as I said, the architecture reflects the architecture of the chorale. Bach allows it to maintain its structural integrity. Now, here's my tiny little rabbit hole, because I love this rabbit hole. In the Baroque period, because it was not about symmetry, rather it was about the organic unfolding in time of a piece of art. The proportion that matters is not half to half, but the golden mean, the golden ratio, that 0.618. And for fun, I always begin by taking the number of bars and I multiply it by 0.618 just to see if Bach has done something interesting there. And in this case, the 0.618 bar 75 is exactly where this B section begins in the Choral Fantasia. And then, just to see how amazing mathematically this is, I went to the chorale, and where that B phrase, remember A repeats, so it's A, and B, and they're roughly in thirds, that is also 0.6. So that is the organic working out, that is nature unfolding, that if you think of a conch shell, a nautilus, that is the 0.618. And this is why, my fellow Bach lovers, this is why the motto is so important when we look at the music of Bach, because the idea is that that tiny seed of music, that tiniest little motive, generates the rest of the movement. And so, to finish talking about the architecture of this particularly glorious chorus, what did he do at 0.618? Well, he is passing around as a little duet the motto between the violins. Have a listen. Second violin, first violin again, second. And what he does, do you remember how I said that just like in a da capo aria, to create the architecture, Bach used the full ritornello at the beginning and at the end to frame the work, to frame its architecture in time. Well, what he does to set the material of the B phrase apart is to frame it with what I just played by using that motto over and over again in different keys, sometimes major, sometimes minor, imitating itself, but also germinating itself, creating a full panoply of musical phrases from the initial motto. So now what I would like you to hear is I'm going to go to that section in the recording, and you will hear that motive being passed between the violins, and then the choir comes in on that lieblich in those long notes, but as chords, no more soprano over the top. And then I'm going to go just far enough so you hear that schön. And then at the end of the episode, if you feel like it, after I come back and say a few things, if you feel like going back, you might listen to the episode again. And now that you understand the architecture, you'll hear it differently. And I go through all of this because that means that throughout the complete Bach, when you come to our concerts, you can begin each movement by thinking, how will Bach unfold his music, germinating that seed and creating a larger architecture? So here we go. This is the motto passed around to the block chords lieblich, starting into then the schön und herrlich. Have a listen. Isn't this just spectacular music? And to think that there is a whole world of it awaiting us over the next decade of the complete Bach. I do want to make very quick mention in passing of the other pieces that have been written for choir and soloists by Bach, because these pieces will come up as we go through all of Bach's works over the years. And these are actually much more famous than any individual cantatas. These are the major choral works of Bach. In particular, the four big ones: the B minor Mass, the Christmas Oratorio, and the two Passion settings that have been left full to us. There are fragments of others, but the St. Matthew Passion and the St. John Passion, and then various other medium-sized pieces like the Easter Oratorio, the Ascension Oratorio, and in a category of their own, the 6 motets for choir. Why am I not going to give you a separate episode about all of those? It's because as we face each of them over the next decade, they will be given an Unlocking Bach podcast episode so we can look at them in greater detail. For now, all that you need to know is that they are not significantly different in terms of their makeup from cantatas. They are longer, and there is narrative often to these works, but still they have recitatives of 2 types, and they have choruses, and they have chorales. The great exception to that, of course, being the B minor Mass, but we have plenty of time to talk about that as well. But in a large sense, in 3 very quick episodes of Bach 101, we have talked about more than half of Bach's output. We're now ready to turn the corner and in our next episode begin talking about Bach's keyboard and then his other instrumental music. I don't know about you, but I'm so excited to come back again and talk Bach. Thank you so much.